In the shadowy world of financial crime, where audacity meets intellect, one man stood apart from all others. His name was Robert Vesco, and his story reads like a thriller that Hollywood would reject as too implausible. Yet every word is true. This is the tale of how a high school dropout from Detroit orchestrated the biggest financial heist of his era, bribed a sitting U.S. president, bankrolled one of America's greatest political scandals, and then spent 23 years playing a game of cat and mouse with the world's most powerful governments. A game he almost won. The unlikely beginning. Robert Vesco wasn't born into wealth or privilege. Growing up in Depression-era Detroit, he dropped out of high school and worked as an auto mechanic. But Vesco possessed something money couldn't buy: a brilliant, calculating mind and an almost supernatural ability to read people and exploit their weaknesses. By his early 30s, through a combination of charm, strategic investments, and ruthless business tactics, he clawed his way into the executive suite of a small aerospace company. But legitimate business was never enough for Vesco. He had tasted power, and he wanted more, much more. The heist that shocked America. In 1970, Vesco executed a financial maneuver so brazen it would define his legacy forever. He took control of Investors Overseas Services, IOS, a mutual fund empire managing billions of dollars for hundreds of thousands of investors worldwide. What happened next was systematic looting on a scale never before seen. Over the next 2 years, Vesco siphoned off $224 million from the fund, equivalent to over $1.5 billion in today's money. He created a labyrinth of shell companies, offshore accounts, and fake transactions so complex that forensic accountants are still untangling them decades later. Widows lost their life savings. Retirees saw their pensions evaporate. Ordinary families who trusted their money to what seemed like a legitimate investment vehicle were financially destroyed. But stealing the money was only the beginning. Vesco knew that U.S. authorities would eventually catch on. What he did next elevated him from common thief to criminal mastermind. Buying a president. As federal investigators began circling in 1972, Vesco made a decision that would change American political history. He contributed $200,000 in cash, delivered in a briefcase, to President Richard Nixon's reelection campaign. This wasn't just a donation. It was a down payment on protection. The money was illegal even by the loose standards of the time, made after new campaign finance laws had taken effect. But Vesco wasn't buying a campaign poster. He was buying influence at the highest levels of American power. Through his connections to Nixon's inner circle, he sought to derail the Securities and Exchange Commission investigation into his activities. The plan almost worked. For a while, the SEC investigation slowed to a crawl. Nixon's Attorney General, John Mitchell, and Commerce Secretary, Maurice Stans, allegedly intervened on Vesco's behalf. But Vesco's money and connections couldn't stop what was coming. The contribution became public, adding another explosive chapter to the unfolding Watergate scandal that would eventually bring down Nixon's presidency. Vesco had helped bankroll Watergate, though his role often gets overshadowed by the break-in itself. The illegal campaign contribution was one of many threads investigators pulled that unraveled Nixon's administration. In the end, Vesco's attempt to buy political protection only made him more notorious. The Great Escape. By 1972, with federal indictments looming and investigators closing in, Vesco did what any rational criminal would do. He ran. But this was no ordinary escape. Vesco didn't just flee to a neighboring country and hope for the best. He embarked on a decades-long odyssey that would take him across continents and into the protection of some of the world's most controversial regimes. His first stop was Costa Rica, where he cultivated relationships with the country's president, buying protection with generous investments and bribes. He lived openly in a luxury compound, thumbing his nose at U.S. extradition requests. When Costa Rican authorities eventually tired of harboring America's most wanted white-collar criminal, Vesco moved on. The Bahamas became his next refuge. Then Antigua. At each stop, Vesco adapted his strategy, ingratiating himself with local power brokers, investing in legitimate businesses as cover, and always staying one step ahead of American law enforcement. He tried to establish his own nation on a Caribbean island, a criminal state where he'd be beyond the reach of any government. The plan failed, but it demonstrated Vesco's grandiose ambitions and his refusal to accept conventional limits. Castro's guest. In 1982, Vesco found what he thought would be his final sanctuary, Cuba. Fidel Castro's communist island was the perfect hideout. Cuba had no extradition treaty with the United States, and Castro delighted in harboring someone who'd embarrassed the American government so thoroughly. For years, Vesco lived comfortably in Havana, enjoying the protection of the Cuban state. He reportedly advised Castro on economic matters, helped the regime evade international sanctions, and some sources claim he was involved in drug trafficking operations that funneled money to the Cuban government. Vesco had found the one place where American power couldn't reach him. But Vesco made a fatal miscalculation. He thought money and utility would keep him safe forever. He forgot that dictators are loyal only to themselves. The final betrayal. After 23 years of successfully evading every government and law enforcement agency on Earth, Vesco's luck finally ran out. Not through American ingenuity, but through the treachery of the very dictator who'd protected him. In the mid-1990s, Vesco became involved in a scheme to manufacture and market a drug he claimed could cure cancer and AIDS. Whether he believed in the drug or whether it was just another con is unclear. What is clear is that the scheme embarrassed Castro on the international stage, drawing unwanted attention to Cuba's harboring of criminals and creating diplomatic complications. Castro had Vesco arrested in 1995. The man who'd outsmarted presidents, outmaneuvered the SEC, the FBI, and Interpol, and lived as a fugitive king for more than 2 decades, was thrown into a Cuban prison, not by the forces of justice, but by the whim of a dictator who no longer found him useful. The vanishing. Vesco was sentenced to 13 years in prison for fraud and illicit economic activity. But then something strange happened. He disappeared. Cuban authorities released almost no information about him. There were rumors he died in 2007, but the Cuban government never confirmed it. No body was produced. No grave was shown. No death certificate was made public until years later. Robert Vesco, the man who'd lived his entire adult life in the spotlight of infamy, evaporated into mystery. The con man who'd manipulated presidents and dictators, who'd stolen hundreds of millions and funded political scandals, simply ceased to exist in any verifiable way. The lesson. Vesco's story is more than a true crime tale. It's a parable about the limits of money, the corruptibility of power, and the ultimate futility of living outside the bounds of society. For 23 years, Vesco thought he'd won. He'd beaten the system, outsmarted everyone, and lived consequence-free in tropical paradises. But in the end, a life built on theft and deception is a house of cards. The very protection he bought with stolen money became his prison. The dictator he trusted betrayed him. The freedom he thought he'd secured turned out to be an illusion. Robert Vesco died alone, forgotten, in a Cuban jail, a fitting end for a man who thought money could buy anything, even escape from justice itself.